So, last class, so we're on the section, first of all, remember we're on the section, we're on the middle scope, so the part about, generating the wish to be free from samsara. And we've covered, the various lists, right, the 8 kinds of suffering, the 6 kinds of suffering, and so on. And then we got to, so that was which corresponds to the first noble truth, right, the truth of suffering. And then we covered section here where Lama Tsongkhapa covered the second noble truth, the cause of suffering, with the main cause being mental afflictions and karma. And so having an existence that's controlled by mental afflictions and karma, which is this samsara, right? Our aggregates, way of being, as the cause of samsara. And then we were going through, Lama Tsongkhapa was describing last time we covered this process where Lama Tsongkhapa was describing, after discussing how karma was accumulated, he describes the process of death and the bardo, controlled by karma. So he's describing the process, right, how due to the mental afflictions and karma, how beings die and take birth, which is the process of samsara. Right? So he's sort of completing that section. That's where we're up to. So we covered last time, the death process and the bardo, and we just barely started the process of birth, which is a very brief section. But Lama Tsongkhapa describes then how beings take birth in samsara. Right? So as a samsaric being, uncontrolled, right, our karma causes us to die. Then we take the kind of intermediate state, and then we don't get to choose our birth, but our karma kind of throws us. That's what we call it sometimes, throwing karma, right? So the karma throws us into a birth. So last time, at the very end, we just very briefly covered, Lama Tsongkhapa covered how, and they kind of connect. So first he was discussing, so we'll briefly cover birth. So he first covers human birth, how humans are born. And from a Buddhist perspective, it's interesting, like, when he's talking about birth here, he means conception, actually. Like, usually when we talk about birth, we mean like when the child comes out of the mother's womb. But the way Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about here is a typical Buddhist way of talking about, which is conception. So that whole process from conception up to the time when the fetus or the infant comes out of the womb, that's all sort of that process of birth. So the infant, they actually, it doesn't go into it here. In other texts, it's interesting. Buddhist texts go into great deal of detail describing the process of fetal development and all that. Their actual texts sort of describe all of that in a bit of detail, which is interesting since it's quite, texts were written over 2,000 years ago, but they describe the process quite a bit. But here, Lama Tsongkhapa is not getting to that. He's talking about, so the being who's been in the bardo, when they have to have the karma with those, it's for a human birth, with the particular parents, right, some karmic connection. And he's describing how of course, the parents are engaging in sexual union. And then he's describing how, and I was saying that just at the very end last time I started to bring this up, Lama Tsongkhapa gets into this thing where he goes through each realm, each of the 6 realms that you can take birth in, and he describes how the process of sort of entering into that realm, of leaving the bardo and entering into that realm, whichever realm, good or bad, involves a moment of anger. So the bardo being experienced as a moment of anger that sort of corresponds to and even causes, in some sense, the end of that bardo existence and then the taking of the birth. And so here Lama Tsongkhapa began with, in the human birth, where the parents are engaging in sexual union, and the future child, so a bardo being, experiences, in this context, a desire for the parent of the opposite gender, and then experiences a moment of anger at the parent of the same gender that the person is going to take birth as, and that's the moment of anger that sort of ends that bardo existence and leads to the entering the womb. And Lama Tsongkhapa next goes into a little more detail. So he's talking about, it's not just entering the womb, but he describes the fluids, right? In Buddhist, actually in Buddhist texts, they talk about the semen and blood. They use their term blood for the egg, but that's what they're talking about there. And so he's talking about how those fluids have mixed, and he's talking about the sperm and the egg have joined, and then he says they've turned into something that looks a bit like cooled boiled milk. He's kind of describing what the substance is like inside the womb of the mother. And he says in the consciousness, after having experienced that moment of desire and anger, the bardo ends and the being is then inside that goop. This is almost like what he's describing. And then he makes a small point, which I'll just mention here. He makes this point that he says, I'll actually read the sentence. He says, the consciousness that enters at that time is posited as the basis of all by those who accept the basis of all. Those who do not accept the basis of all assert that it is the mental consciousness that transmigrates. And just to briefly explain that, what he's saying there is that followers of the mind-only school of Buddhist philosophy assert the existence of something called the mind as basis of all. So they actually assert 8 kinds of consciousness, like eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, bodily, tactile bodily consciousness. Then they assert a mental consciousness, right? But then they assert 2 more. A mind as basis of all, which to them is like the place where the karmic seeds reside. The seeds of karma reside on this kind of mind as basis of all. And they talk about an afflicted mentality or an afflicted consciousness. Whereas the Madhyamaka, the middle way school, doesn't assert 8, only asserts 6. So the 5 sense consciousness and mental consciousness. So what he's saying here is that those who are followers of the mind-only school would say it's this mind as basis of all, which is like the kind of fundamental consciousness on which the karmic seeds reside that enters that substance. And then, of course, since for example, others too, but take the example of the middle way, followers of for example, the consequence school, the middle way, Chandrakirti's position, would be there is no mind as basis of all, so it can't be the mind as basis of all that enters the womb, of course, because it doesn't exist according to his philosophy. So he would say it's the mental consciousness, a subtle level of the mental consciousness. So that's what Lama Tsongkhapa always kind of goes for the points that people could get confused about and heads straight towards them and tries to address them, or does address them. And then at that point, one more small distinction to make is at that point, there's just the mental consciousness there inside the fertilized egg, you could say. And then gradually, over the course of the Buddhist text describe how gradually the other 5 senses develop, along with, as the organs develop, the other 5 senses develop. And so, of course, over time, and we know this, right, the fetus becomes capable of hearing, becomes capable of taste, becomes capable of some kind of visual sense of light, dark. And so he's describing that process. And then he goes through another point where he says, you won't take birth without desire. Like, in other words, that even once the being's in the bardo, then when they're going to sort of be drawn to a place of birth, they're drawn there by desire. So he's pointing out that, again, remember the root afflictions, right? So desire and anger both always play a role in the process of taking rebirth, is what he's saying. And so he's saying, so first you're drawn somewhere, and then you experience anger. And so he's saying that being drawn to the place of birth is due to desire, right? So you desire something. And then he's sort of raising a point where people could have confusion. So he's saying, well, okay, if somebody's drawn to the place of birth by desire, like, how would people who are born to a bad rebirth then? How could that be? And he's saying it's there's a couple things. One is it's due to a kind of false appearance, or almost like a dream-like hallucination, like a dream appearance, you could say. But it's not exactly a dream because you're not asleep, you're in the bardo. But there's a kind of false appearance as there are in dreams. That's the point. And he's saying that those false appearances, the ones that sort of lead us to birth, are according to what we desire. And so he's giving an example here. He says, so for example, someone who in their life spent their life killing sheep, right? That was their job. They were like a butcher. In the bardo, they'll have the appearance of sheep there. And they'll think, oh, it's time to go to work, kind of thing. Oh, I've got to go over there and kill those sheep. And so they enter that place out of their, it's like what's the word? Habitual pattern of attachment. Does that make sense? Just like in our dreams, we have these habitual patterns, right? Some people dream of one thing, some, like, there's, what's the word? Everybody dreams of different things depending on our predispositions. So it's similar in the bardo. Does that make sense? And birth. So whatever we've sort of been habituated to, that appears, and we're, if we had an attachment to it, we're drawn to it. And so he's making this point. He says, or those who traded in poultry or pigs will see that and be drawn to it. So whatever you were sort of, he's just giving examples here. But he's saying whatever you were sort of habituated to sort of moving towards, you have appearances like that, and they draw you to your place of birth. And then he says, and then when you get to that place, so he says you rush there with the light of previous familiarity, right? So he's saying we have this mental habit, and so with some feeling of like delight or attachment or sort of, oh yeah, I'm getting what I want, you go there. And then he says, then the being becomes angry at the form of the birthplace. So he's saying is if it's a bad birthplace, the being thinks, oh, I'm going to go kill a pig or something. And then when it gets there, it suddenly realizes, oh, I'm not in the role of the butcher anymore. Suddenly, either I'm in hell or I'm the pig or whatever. And they become angry at that appearance, which of course makes sense. They might become angry at that appearance. And one might become angry at that appearance. And then suddenly, and then at that moment of anger happens, and then they're reborn. That they take that rebirth. Okay. So, and then, and so he's just going through and saying the same thing applies for all the different realms, animals, hungry ghosts, humans, that there's some kind of an appearance, there's a being drawn towards that appearance, then there's anger, and then there's birth. And so he goes through, that's true whether you're taking rebirth as an animal, or as a human, or as a hell being, or as a hungry ghost, or God, even a god.
So are ghosts born in the womb?
Oh no, so that's the next point. Okay, good question. So then he goes through exactly what Fidel was asking, good time. That there are 4 types of birth. And so they're not all womb births, and we know that because we've seen eggs, right? And so he's going through and saying that there are 4, in Buddhist texts, they describe 4 types of birth. So the first one is womb birth, which he just covered, right? So he's describing that, he already described the process of womb birth, but then here he mentions there are 3 other types of birth. And so I'm going to do them out of order, but so one type is miraculous birth, and that would be applied to both the God realms and the hell realms, both. And so a miraculous birth, he's saying, where is that here? If you are born miraculously, you are born upon desiring the abode. So here he's describing how if you're going to a God realm, you feel attracted to the pleasures of that God realm, and you go there and are born. And then he's saying with the hell realms that there are beings who, if they died sort of deeply wanting, they felt cold, so they were deeply wanting heat, so then they feel attracted to the heat. This sometimes happens, and then they're attracted to the heat, and so they get there, and then of course it's too hot, and they become angry for going there. Or some people die feeling wanting cold, like they feel a fever, and so they want to be cooler, and then they're attracted to the cold, but then they realize it's too cold. So he describes that process. So, but this miraculous birth means like suddenly they appear in a kind of body that's of that realm, but it's not. It doesn't have parents in that sense. Right? It's sort of it appears due to the force of karma, and it's kind of a mental habit body, they call it, or something. It's a body that has substance in that realm, but it's not like it's not made of flesh and bone and brought from parents. Then the 2 other types of birth, another is egg, and then he makes the point, egg birth is similar to womb birth. It's a similar process. And then there's, so he mentions birth from heat and moisture. Right? So that's where like, it's not born from an egg and it's not born from parents, but in sort of water. And he says that comes from, in that kind of birth, one is attached to odor, a smell. and that draws the person in. So he's just describing these different types of birth. But there were other texts that go into more detail about the process of birth. He just covers it briefly here. And remember, in this context, he's not teaching this to sort of go into, the point here is not to go into great detail about this topic. He's describing the process of samsara, right? So that's what he's been going through, right? So in other words, due to the force of mental afflictions and karma, we die. As we're dying, we have the grasping itself, right? That gives rise to mental afflictions. Those mental afflictions activate a karma. That karma leads to a certain kind of bardo body, right? That bardo body wanders and then has this kind of experience and takes birth again as a samsaric being. So that's the point here, right? Is that this is the process through which one repeatedly cycles in samsara and has been since beginningless time, and continues to cycle until one achieves liberation. So then comes an important point. So Lama Tsongkhapa says the measure of having the attitude, the measure of the attitude having been developed. And so he's entering a new section here. I mean, same general section, but a new point. And what he's talking about here is, so he's saying we have to meditate on these topics again and again, right, on the nature of samsara. And then he says, the goal here, though, of this whole section is to generate what is sometimes, oftentimes translated as renunciation. Or sometimes it's translated differently as a more literal translation, I think from Tibetan, is definite emergence, a mind of definite emergence, a mind that definitely wants to emerge, meaning definitely wants to emerge from samsara. And so here he says, when you have come to understand the characteristics of cyclic existence, right, of samsara, in detail, from the point of view of the two, sufferings and their origins, right? So he's saying you have to have meditated and understood the first two noble truths, right? That the nature of suffering and what the cause of suffering is. And he says, then he says, if you do that over and over again, right, eventually you'll give rise to a desire to abandon them. And the desire that arises to attain their complete pacification is indeed the thought to definitely emerge, right? So he's saying, first of all, there's a couple of points implicit there, right? You won't generate this mind of renunciation wishing to emerge from samsara unless you do contemplate suffering and the cause of suffering in depth over and over again, right? Because we're habituated to just chasing after samsara, right? To causing more samsara. It's a deeply habituated thing. And so if you don't contemplate these fundamental teachings of the Buddha, then you won't generate renunciation. Does that make sense? So he's saying you have to contemplate those points over and over again and understand them, and then you'll want to pacify the cause of suffering in order to achieve liberation. Then he says something interesting. He says, however, that alone is not sufficient. Then he says, therefore, you should generate that mind to the same extent as the mind of someone who does not want to be stuck in a house ablaze with fire, or stay locked up in prison, to the same extent that it desires liberation from them. Then it will still be necessary to increase it. So he's talking about a very powerful. Right, he's trying to get a sense. He's trying to share with us. Like, I'm going to pause there. Like, if you think about that, right? What he's sharing, I think, is a powerful sense of the experience, right? Or he's somebody who's realized this, and what he's saying is like, it's not enough to just sort of have thought about this a few times and sort of intellectually said, oh, samsara is bad, it'd be good to achieve nirvana. That's not going to do much. In the next section he says, he quotes Sharawi, he says, that will be no more than a mediocre thought, like flour thrown into sour milk. Right? If you were trying to make some kind of, Tibetans going to make a dough that they eat, like a sampa dough. It tastes quite nice. And he says, but if you just throw some old flour in some sour milk, that's not going to give you a good lunch. You know? And he's saying, kind of like that, it's not sufficient to just have some intellectual understanding. And then he says, and then he makes another point. He says, it'll just be words, right? Whereas then your renunciation, if you don't generate this kind of like intense wish to be free, then your renunciation will just be words. It'll be mere words. It's like, you get the idea, right? And I'll read another. This is Lama Tsongkhapa also. In the three principal aspects of the path, he said, he gives a different phrasing for the definition of having generated renunciation. He says, when, by having trained in that way, meaning by having contemplated in detail suffering and the causes of suffering, there is no arising, even for a second, of attraction to the perfections of samsara, and all day and night the intention seeking liberation arises, then the thought of renunciation has been generated. And so he's really talking about, like, right, I mean, go back to his metaphor, he gives one there. One is he's talking about like somebody, like a death row inmate, right, who sent out their, like, request for appeal, right? You know, like, it never leaves the person's mind, right? Will I get my appeal, or am I going to be killed, right? He's giving an analogy there, right? Like, he's trying to get the feeling across, right? And what he's getting at is we've never had this kind of mind before. So it's like he has to use ordinary examples, right, to try to give us a sense of how intense is what is that person's inner experience like? Right? So he's saying it's like a death row inmate, right, who's waiting for the letter, right? And as soon as they wake up, like, that's their thought. When they're falling asleep, that's their thought, right? So he's saying they never have any other, they may have other thoughts, but it's always there. Does that make sense? It's always there under the surface as their sort of baseline, I want to get out of here. Or then he gives this other analogy, right? A person stuck in a house that's on fire, right? Right, like, the person doesn't, no matter, like, what's there to say, right? The person who's stuck in a house on fire doesn't say, well, I'll have my coffee first, right? Before I leave. Right, because it's a matter of life and death. You know? And what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is if you meditate on these points well, then you understand it's more than a matter of life and death, right? It's more dire than just life and death. Because it's infinite deaths, actually, that you'll have if you don't get liberated, right? So he's describing, like, it's even more intense than that, really. But he's just trying to give, like, analogies to help us imagine how that feels. And then he's saying, and once you imagine it, then keep practicing until you get there, and you can have that experience. Does that make sense? And he says, if you think deeply about this over and over again, you know, what does he say here? Then it won't be mere words, right? It'll become this kind of very powerful wish. And then he makes another point, which is, if you haven't, you know, he makes this another point in the next paragraph where he says this, he kind of points out that, you know, the bodhisattva attitude, bodhicitta, right, the wish to lead others from, to free others from samsaric suffering. What he's pointing out is this, if you don't have that intensity for yourself to be free from samsara, and then you say, oh, but I have bodhicitta for others, he's saying that's mere words, like nonsense, right? Because he's saying if you don't understand what samsara is from your own experience, right, then how could then you're not going to understand other suffering, really, you know, and you'll think, oh, others are fine, I'm fine, others are fine, like, so what, you know, your compassion won't be intense. It'll be just intellectual or something, or just flimsy, or just like insubstantial. And so what he's saying here is, if you generate this kind of understanding of samsaric suffering, right? Especially, remember, like we talked about the pervasive suffering of the compounded aggregates, right? This suffering where you understand that samsara really is this process where I have no control, right? I'm totally controlled by my ignorance, my mental afflictions, and karma. Right? And nothing's definite, nothing's certain, right? I'm just thrown around, like, by them. And anything can happen, right? Like, so any little moment where, like, you know, the extremely intense suffering sort of seems like a relief, ordinary people say, oh, everything's fine, right? And he's saying, no, like, you're trapped. You're, like, totally controlled by ignorance and mental afflictions. They're dragging you everywhere. And, like, what he's getting at is if we get to the sense of understanding that kind of suffering and feeling that's unbearable, right? Like, I want to be liberated, I want to be free, I want to be able to choose my own experiences and not be, like, thrown into experiences by karma and mental afflictions. But he's saying when you understand that for yourself, and then you see others controlled by their ignorance, mental afflictions, and karma, you'll find that unbearable. Does that make sense? But if you don't understand that kind of suffering in your own experience, you know, then you just think, oh, everything's fine, like, you know, no big deal. Or something. And your compassion won't have power to it. Does that make sense, kind of? So, in one way, you could say this: when you meditate on the nature of your own suffering, right? When you meditate on that deeply, actually, in one sense, like I said, you're generating compassion for yourself, which is renunciation, right? You could say renunciation, this mind of definite emergence or renunciation, is actually compassion for yourself. Then when you meditate on the suffering of others, you're generating compassion for others and bodhicitta for them. And these same points of suffering you have to meditate on for others. Does that make sense? It's not enough just to say like, oh, somebody had cancer. Or something like that. I mean, that's fine. That's the basis of compassion. But the compassion that Buddhism is getting at, you have just as much compassion for the healthy person. Does that make sense? You have just as much compassion for the poor, but also just as much for a rich person, for example, because they're totally controlled, right? And they don't have, the good fortune of being healthy or being rich is like a brief dream, right? So like that the person thinks is real. So that's no real freedom. Does that make sense? So it's that kind of compassion that one is generating here. So it's interesting, right? I mean, one has to understand this kind of deep kind of suffering. And one more point I was going to make is he's talking also. He doesn't use this word, but what part of what he's getting here is empathy, right? And like it's what's there to say, right? Like sometimes it's easy to empathize with others, and sometimes we are terrible at empathizing with others, right? And part of what Lama Tsongkhapa is implicitly saying, or I think, this is my own reflection now, is, like I'm just going to give a conventional example from him. Like, I think if we're not willing to face a certain kind of suffering as human beings, I'm just talking about normal human experience, like from him. If we're not willing to face the suffering that we go through as human beings in our own experience, then when somebody comes to us who's experiencing that, what's there to say? We don't empathize, right? Because if you empathize, it means you have to feel it, right? You have to feel some portion of it, or something of it. And so if we close ourselves down to part of the difficulties of life, or the pain, or the agony, or, then we fail to empathize with others. Does that make sense? And part of what he's getting at here is, so if you're not willing to face your own experiences of suffering, then you're not going to empathize with the suffering of others. Does that make sense? And so that you have to begin by looking at your own experience. That's the only way you'll get to be able to reach the point of being able to really empathize with the suffering of others, and then generate bodhicitta. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Just want to make sure that makes sense to people.
So you're feeling, the renouncing of samsara, you're feeling yourself, your own feelings, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you overcome that though?
Overcome what?
That feeling of your feeling.
Which feeling?
If you're able to feel your own feelings of pain and whatever, so how do you overcome them?
The idea then is that you generate you have to know there's a path to liberation, right? Uh-huh. And then, like, if you're aware, wow, all this suffering, right? And like you really feel the awareness of that. Then it's like, I'm using his metaphor, right? Yeah. Then it's like the person, say it right, like, let's say for example you're in, I'll just use his example. Like, so if the person is in a burning house, mm-hmm. right? So they see, wow, like, and they see other people are being burned alive. So you want to get out. You see it's like suffering, right? And you're starting to feel the sparks hitting your skin, even, and your the heat blowing on your face and all that, right? You know you're about to burn, right? And then you see, oh wow, it's difficult, but I could climb down this vine, and I could make it out. I could survive, but it would be very hard, right? Like if the house were fine, you wouldn't try the vine, right? You wouldn't try that. But if it's on fire and you're about to burn, then you jump and you grab on and you climb down, even if it's difficult. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so the idea here is like that. In other words, he's saying, that's why he's teaching the path to liberation. So he's saying, there's a way out of that suffering. And he's saying, so if you see how bad the suffering is, and then I'm showing you, here's the window, here's the vine to get down, there's the safety, like, climb out and grab on, and don't wait to do that. So does that make sense? Yeah. So that's the idea. It's not like to just, it's to motivate the person to become liberated from samsara. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions about that? Because then again, Lama Tsongkhapa, I've been pointing this out, Lama Tsongkhapa often does this in the text. And so then he goes to the points that people could misunderstand, right? Which is definitely, his Holiness the Dalai Lama points out, that's one of Lama Tsongkhapa's great strengths as an author, is that the things that other people either could misunderstand or would ignore because it's like hard to get, he goes straight at those points. So he goes in a number of different points to eliminate misconceptions, right? And so the first one is he says, somebody might think, right? He just thought this other point. And he says, somebody might think, and I'll read the quote. If you cultivate extreme revulsion and disenchantment with cyclic existence, you will fall into the extreme of individual peace, like the hearers, right? The Shravakas, the individual people who are seeking their own liberation, because of your dislike for re-entering cyclic existence. Therefore, it is becoming for Hinayanists to cultivate disenchantment, but is inappropriate for bodhisattvas. Right, so he's saying somebody could object and think that. Does that make sense? Like, somebody could think, well, yeah, of course you have to study the Four Noble Truths, and you have to meditate on the nature of the suffering nature of samsara and its causes, if you're some kind of Hinayanist. But there's like an arrogant kind of idea, right? But I'm Mahayanist, I don't have to think about that, right? Because I'm going to stay in samsara to help others. So why would I want to think about the faults of samsara? Does that make sense? So he's saying somebody could think that, right? Which actually people do sometimes.
Dr. Lama, it almost looks like he called Hinayanist hearer only.
Oh yeah, so hearer is a translation of Shravaka. Yeah. So it is, like it means, actually...
That actually is not true though, is it? That's not how we perceive it.
What do you mean?
The Hinayanist just as a Shravakas. There are people who take that path and also get enlightenment.
Oh yeah, no, so hearer means, like, hearer is actually a positive term, just to be clear. What a hearer in this context means is somebody who listened to the teachings of the Buddha themselves. Like the original Shravakas were the people who got to hear the teachings of the Buddha. Right. Like the, what's it called? And also who helped others to hear. Actually, there's two connotations of hearer, in a sense. So it's like talking about people like Shariputra, Mahamogga, it's actually a term of praise for them, saying that they listened to the Buddha himself, right, and helped others to listen to the Buddha by sharing his teaching with others, and thereby achieved their own liberation from samsara. So they achieved arhat state. So he's talking about people like that. So he's not criticizing them. He's saying that those are valid practices, of course, and he's maybe even teaching those. But here he's pointing out somebody who's practicing Mahayana might think, well, since I'm not like that, I want to achieve Buddhahood, I don't need to think about this topic. So here he's addressing a specific problem, but he's not. Here is like here in that sense is actually it's a translation of that term from Sanskrit Shravaka, but it's actually it's a term of praise referring to people who listened to the teachings of the Buddha and helped others hear them. That's the point. So it's not saying, oh, just somebody who only listens. Those people actually practice the teachings also. But okay, so now he gives 4 points to refute that idea. Does that make sense? So next he says somebody might object in this way and think this idea, and now he's going to address it and say there are 4 reasons why that's not a correct idea. So the first point, actually I'm going to read it and then I'll explain it because I think it's subtle. He says, his first response is, there's a statement, he quotes a statement from a sutra. There is a sutra, which sutra is it? The sutra showing the Tathagata's inconceivable secret. And that sutra has a quote which says, thus a bodhisattva should not be terrified by cyclic existence. And so he's saying, somebody could read that quote and think, oh, so bodhisattvas don't need to think about the faults of samsara. They're not terrified, they think it's fine. Right? And he's saying that, basically what he's saying is that's a misunderstanding of that quote. And now he's going to explain what he means. He says, the meaning of that statement is not to point out that he should not be repulsed by the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death, and so on, of wandering in cyclic existence under the power of karma and mental afflictions. Rather, the point of that quote is that due to the bodhisattva's bodhicitta, the bodhisattva's mind of enlightenment, the bodhisattva should not be afraid to take rebirth in cyclic existence for the benefit of sentient beings under the power of aspirational prayers and compassion. So here he's getting at something which I want to explain just a little bit what he's saying here, really. Like, he's getting at is that bodhisattvas are and should be terrified of being a samsaric being controlled by karma and mental afflictions and ignorance. And he's saying bodhisattvas, of course, should be terrified by that. It's miserable. There's nothing good about it. Then what he's saying here, though, and then I was going to explain this in the context of a teaching from the Uttara Tantra. In the Uttara Tantra, it points out that bodhisattvas from the first bhumi on, so when the bodhisattvas seen emptiness directly, they no longer take rebirth due to the power of karma and mental afflictions. They still take rebirth in relation to samsaric beings through and this is what he's saying here, through the power of their aspirational prayers and compassion. Right? And so what he's saying here is that kind of relating to samsaric beings, bodhisattvas should not be afraid of, right? Because they don't experience the gross sufferings of samsara. They don't take birth, whereas their birth is different. At that point, their birth isn't thrown by mental afflictions and karma. When that kind of bodhisattva dies, it's their bodhicitta and their aspiration, right? They've prayed, may I take birth to help those who are, like it's always thought as long as space endures, for as long as sentient beings remain, may I remain, to dispel the misery of the world, right? And then they make specific prayers, may I help the people of this place and that place and this kind of person and that kind of person. And so when they die, those aspirational prayers of compassion are what lead them to take their next appearance. And in the Uttara Tantra it says, although from other people's perspective they have the appearance of being born, of aging, of getting sick, and of dying, that's not their subjective experience. Whereas their inner experience is not of that. They don't experience those things in the way they seem to. They have a different way of being, actually. And so what Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying is, so when it says the bodhisattva should not be terrified of cyclic existence, of samsara, he's saying, for somebody who's like that, for an Arya bodhisattva who's seen emptiness directly and is taking birth through the force of their bodhicitta and prayer to benefit others, they shouldn't be afraid of that. In other words, they should delight in that, because that's the way they become a Buddha, right? So for them, they're like pleased. Oh, I get to go continue on the path, right? And practice generosity and practice morality and practice, all the 6 perfections and progress to Buddhahood. So for them, it's a delightful process in a sense, right? It's not a process of uncontrolled. They're not subject to ordinary birth, aging, sickness, and death. And so he's saying for that, they shouldn't be afraid of that. But he's saying they should be afraid of birth due to the force of karma and mental afflictions. So that's his first point. Then he goes on and he says, in fact, as we wander in existence, meaning samsaric existence, under the power of karma and the mental afflictions, we are oppressed by many sufferings and cannot even bring about our own welfare, let alone anyone else's. Right? Then he says, since that is the door to all degeneration, there is need to block it, having developed extreme disenchantment, more than the Hinayanists. Right? So he's saying here, bodhisattvas actually have more disenchantment with that kind of process. While it is necessary to enjoy taking rebirth in existence under the power of aspirational prayers and compassion, in accordance with that, it also says in the same sutras. Now he's saying, I'm not just making this up, because if you read the rest of the sutra, it says, quote, bodhisattvas having taken care of ripening sentient beings view cyclic existence as beneficial, unlike the great passage into peace. Right? So there he's making it very clear, and he's saying bodhisattvas actually have more horror at, and actually you do, right? If you have compassion for yourself and for others, then you're horrified by, whereas being unable to help anybody because you're under the power of your own mental afflictions and karma. And then also we even lead others to more problems, right? Like, so saying a bodhisattva wants to free others from suffering. And how horrifying to a bodhisattva to be under the control of mental afflictions and karma, where they're just suffering and miserable, they can't help anybody else, and sometimes they make more problems for others, right? So they're saying that's not what a bodhisattva wants. A bodhisattva actually has a more revulsion to that. But through the power of their bodhicitta, the bodhisattva is quite joyful, right? At the benefit of, through the power of bodhicitta and aspirational prayers, of manifesting bodies to practice the six perfections, right, and to be of benefit to others. Because the idea, to a bodhisattva, the idea of passing into individual peace, of saying, yes, I don't want to take birth under the power of mental affliction and karma, but the idea of just sort of, drifting off in my own individual sort of peace, and not helping others who are undergoing horrific suffering, would be horrifying to them. Does that make sense? So like the idea of individual peace is horrifying to the bodhisattva for themselves. Like there was to say, I don't want my own individual peace, not when those I love are suffering. Right? So the bodhisattva says, I'm so joyful to go, and it's great benefit to go there because I can help others. And I can get better and better at helping others and become more and more effective at helping others. By myself, continuing to progress through the stages and the paths in order to become a Buddha. And they see themselves actually doing that, right? Helping others and watching others progress, watching themselves progress. So for them, it's like a wonderful benefit to take birth through the power of aspirational prayers and compassion. So that's the second point. Then he makes a third point. He's really hammering away at somebody who misunderstood that point now. Right, so you would think that's enough, right? Maybe, but he's going to keep going. Two more points. He's saying what he's making the point is don't ever think that, right? Don't ever have that wrong understanding. So he's saying not only that. Now he says in the Bodhisattva levels, which is a text by Asanga, the great Bodhisattva Asanga, he says it is set forth that if someone who expresses himself in the above manner, without differentiating between them, so. Has the bodhisattva vows, he commits an afflicted infraction. So what he's saying there is, he's saying not only was that idea that bodhisattvas shouldn't think about suffering and he should suffer wrong, but he's saying Asanga in the bodhisattva levels, which is one of the great Buddhist classics, he's saying you're breaking your bodhisattva vow if you think that. So if you think, oh, I'm a bodhisattva, so I don't have to meditate on the nature of suffering and the cause of suffering, like I'm beyond that. He says, if you think you're a Mahayanist when you're saying that you're a bodhisattva when saying that, even as you're saying it, you're breaking your bodhisattva vow. Does that make sense? So he's saying, so that's how wrong that is that, there's like, if you think, oh, I'm a yeah, you get it. If you say, oh, I think I'm keeping my bodhisattva vow because I'm not going to give up on, I'm not going to think about the faults of samsara, even as you think that, you're already breaking your bodhisattva vow. So it's that wrong. That's how mistaken that idea is.
So, but you can't become a bodhisattva without meditating on that, though.
Yeah, you have to meditate on the sufferings of samsara, right?
You have to become,
Yeah, so he's just saying if somebody took the bodhisattva vow, but like took the vow but wasn't really a bodhisattva yet, and then had this thought that they'd be breaking that. And then he makes a final point. He says, having developed revulsion for cyclic existence, right, means samsara, to see those sentient beings as one's relatives, and thus generate the mind of enlightenment for their sake, is the intention of the 400 stanzas, which is a text by Aryadeva, and is set forth by the great master Chandrakirti in his commentary to that text. Right? So there what he's saying is, he's just pointing out in more detail that the bodhisattva, of course, generates revulsion for samsara. Right? But that he's giving it, again, I think he's being a little experiential here, right? He's saying, if you think of for those of your parents or something, right? Like he's saying, even if you have incredible revulsion for samsara, if it's your child who's stuck there, then you don't think, oh, but I can't go help. There's actually, I just read the other day in the Uttara Tantra also, actually in Asanga's commentary to it, he gives this analogy where he gives this analogy, he says, if a child were to fall into like a, almost like, he doesn't use this term, but if you think like what's it called? When you have like a septic system, and when they lift the top off, there's that like, what's it, disgusting, like, they have to pump out sometimes, like, so that kind of thing, right? Like a cesspool, is that what they call it? He's saying if a child were to fall into a cesspool, he's saying, and it would like fill with disgusting things, he says like, some passerby might think, oh, how horrible, right? And then he says, but if the child's parent were there, right? He says, without even a moment's hesitation, they would dive in to save the child, right? They wouldn't think, oh, it's disgusting, or oh, because it's their child who's drowning, right? And they wouldn't hesitate to dive in. And he says, that's the Bodhisattva's attitude, right? So the song is getting at exactly this point. He's saying, it's not that the Bodhisattva doesn't see it's disgusting, samsara, right? It's that the level of compassion completely overwhelms that. The disgustingness is irrelevant to that Bodhisattva because the compassion is that much more powerful. Does that make sense? So it's like, the song is getting at exactly this point, right? He's saying the compassion is so powerful, but they're not stupid, right? They don't recognize, like when the parent was diving in, they wouldn't think, oh, this is like a beautiful garden. It's like, no, they understand it's disgusting. That makes them want to dive in even more, right? Because they have to, there's even more to protect their child from. Does that make sense? So that's what he's getting at there, right? Is that kind of idea. And so to think like, and like to say, oh, like if you had some idea, oh no, the parent should pretend that the cesspool is a spa. Like, well, that's just silly, right? That would be, like, that's not the point. That actually is sort of insulting to the Bodhisattva in two ways. One is, it's insulting in the sense of, are they delusional? Like, they can recognize what suffering is suffering. And the second is, it actually is a demeaning of their compassion. There is, part of what's so beautiful about the compassion of Bodhisattva is that they will dive into the cesspool to save, right? That they're not averse to engaging with people who have mental afflictions because that's what Bodhisattvas do, right? So that's that. Okay. So those are his 4 refutations of that, which are very, very thorough refutation of that. Again, let's pause. Any questions about that? Okay. So next, Lama Tsongkhapa says, an explanation of how the nature of the path leading to liberation is established, right? So it gets at the Fidel's question now, right? He was saying, all this thought about suffering and the cause of suffering, if there weren't like a path out, it would just be sadistic or something. It would just be, the value of that is to help people see their situation so they can then follow the path to be liberated from that. And so that's presented as the final section of this, final part of this whole middle scope of the Lam Rim. And so he says, through meditation on the shortcomings of cyclic existence as explained earlier, an intense desire to definitely emerge from cyclic existence has arisen. And due to that, there is a need to reverse cyclic existence. So then he says, okay, so if you recognize, right, because you have to have all 4 noble truths, right? For the 4 noble truths, right? So there's suffering, the cause of suffering, then there's liberation and the path to liberation, the second set of noble truths. And he's saying, so one has to be aware of the second set of noble truths, right, which is the path leading to liberation. Then he makes it, so he breaks this down into 2 subsections. One is, what kind of basis, by what kind of basis is cyclic existence averted? And you get cyclic existence means samsara. This is their translation for samsara. So first he quotes a friendly letter, which is a text by Arya Nagarjuna. It says, having obtained a birth of leisure that's free from the so-called defective 8 unfree states, make an effort to avert rebirth. And so Lama Tsongkhapa says, as is set forth here, you need to avert it at this time when you have the leisures and endowments, for it has already been explained that in an unfree state there is no opportunity to avert it. So what he's getting at there is for people like us that we should before getting into the details of the path to liberation, we should pause to remember, well, who can achieve liberation from this samsara, right? Like samsara is like a vast ocean of suffering, right? And then he's reminding us of something that was covered earlier in the Lam Rim, right? Which is, in this vast ocean of cyclic existence or samsara, in most realms, it's impossible to become free, right? Like, so if you were born as, using the examples earlier, if you were born as a pig, or as a goat, or as a hell being, or as a hungry ghost, you can't achieve liberation in that lifetime. Someday you can, but not in that life, right? And they're saying, who can achieve liberation is someone like you. Does that make sense? Somebody with the 8 freedoms and 10 endowments and a human birth. And so he's saying, you know, of all the beings and all of samsara, who's capable of achieving a liberation like we're discussing here? And he's saying it's you. It's somebody like you who has this kind of precious human rebirth. And so again, like we can, you know, you might, this is my own reflection for a moment. Why repeat that here, right? He covered precious human rebirth in a different, earlier in the text. But part of it is that at this point, where we've just thought about the suffering nature of samsara, it further intensifies the feeling, actually, right? It's like, wow, like samsara is a depthless, endless, beginningless and potentially endless ocean of suffering. And the only kind of being who can get liberated from it is someone in this situation that we're in. Like, now is the time. Like, not some other time. It's sort of like a reminder. If you have some thought, oh yeah, in a future life I should really achieve liberation from samsara, that's a mistake, right? Whereas you have to think, it's this life. Now is the time to do it. So then he says, the great yogi Jangchu Rinchen said, now is the time to distinguish ourselves from cattle, right? Pretty pithy, simple. I don't think I need to explain that one. And then Geshe Potawa, right, who was one of the great masters of the mind training, the Lojong teachings, said, since it did not stop by itself when we were roaming about so long previously, it will also not stop itself now. Right? Samsara is not going to end on its own. Right? Therefore, we must avert it. Yet the time to avert it is this time, when we obtain the leisures and endowments. Right? Very clear, isn't it? Right? Samsara won't end on its own. Like, it's not going to run out. Does that make sense? It's not like like a wind-up clock that will run out on its own. We keep creating the causes of it. So he's saying, you know, you can't just wait around for samsara to end. You have to do the work. You have to avert it yourself. For yourself, right? Like, in other words, nobody else can do it for you. The Buddha can't take away your samsara. The Dalai Lama can't take away your samsara. Nobody can take away your samsara except yourself, right? And he's saying, and when is the time to do that? It's the time when you have a precious human rebirth with leisure and endowments, which is now. So he's just being very clear about that. And then he makes another point, which is, you could say, like, one way of phrasing this one is, what's the ideal, the best of all opportunities or situations to achieve liberation from samsara? And he said, what he gets at here is, he says, first of all, you know, it's possible for anybody with a precious human rebirth to achieve some sort of liberation from samsara. But then he points out, you know, the ideal, best way to achieve liberation is to be ordained. So to be an ordained person, monk or nun. And he says, why? Because lay people have many obstacles to accomplishment of the Dharma, and have the drawback of numerous faults. Right? So he's pointing out that, like, in the commentary point this out, right? Like that, you know, as lay people, oftentimes we have the, all kinds of distractions, right? Like jobs and relationship issues and so on. And he's saying, so becoming a monk or a nun is the ideal way to achieve liberation, because there are fewer distractions and one can focus one's life on the Dharma more exclusively. And he quotes the ornament for Mahayana Sutras, which is by Maitreya. He says, those on the side of the ordained have limitless positive qualities. Thus, those exerting themselves in the vow excel over householder bodhisattvas. Right? So that's straightforward. He's saying that's the ideal form. Right? The ordained have a basis for averting cyclic existence. So that's very clear.
Dr. Lawrence, who was Maitreya?
Maitreya is the next Buddha, right? So it was.
So he wrote something already, like there's scriptures from him.
Yeah, there are five treatises of Maitreya, of which the ornament for Mahayana Sutras is one, the ornament, the Abhisamaya Alankara, the Uttarakhanda, there are 5 of them. I'll go through, but the idea is that the way the story goes is that Asanga, the great Bodhisattva Asanga in India, did a retreat on Maitreya, and then eventually received a vision where he could see Maitreya, like person to person. Maitreya kind of came, appeared to him. And they say that Maitreya took him to Tushita Pure Land, Pure Tushita Heaven,
Right.
where he lives, waiting to manifest as Buddha. And while he was there, Maitreya composed these 5 treatises and gave them to Asanga to bring to the earth. So Asanga then Asanga wrote some commentaries based on them. So they said they differentiate, even though in one sense it was Asanga who brought them to India. They say that there are certain texts that Asanga wrote, like the Bodhisattva levels, that they say Asanga himself composed that text. There are other texts that they say, although Asanga was the one who sort of gave them to people,
Right.
they say he himself said this was composed by my guru Maitreya.
I mean, it's a stupid question I'm gonna ask, but I always wonder when they say that he took him, did he take his body
I think so. Yeah, I think that's the idea. I think he went like that. I'm not sure. I don't know exactly how it worked.
But he's supposed to show up sometime in the future.
Yeah,
he
yeah.
hasn't never showed up in
I mean, they say I guess actually, if you think one way of saying it is that Maitreya is supposed to, according to Mahayana Buddhism, and actually even everybody agrees that. I mean, even they're actually even if you look in the Pali Canon, it mentions Maitreya also. So everybody agrees that Maitreya is the next Buddha, and that the Shakyamuni Buddha was not the only Buddha. So all Buddhists agree on that point. If you look in the Pali Canon, it says Maitreya will come. But Buddha actually said that. So about him manifesting, though, they say that, let's see, say it right. According to Mahayana tradition, a 10th bhumi, he's abiding on the 10th bhumi. So there are 10 levels or grounds or bhumis, they say, of a bodhisattva. So of course he's the 10th because he's the next Buddha, right? So he's achieved that level. And so the idea is that, say it right, a 10th bhumi bodhisattva, according to many different texts, is capable of actually sending out infinite emanations, limitless emanations. So, in that sense, he manifests many different ways. Actually, in the story with the Sangha, he manifested as a dog at one point. So they say he manifests in many different ways to benefit others. But the point is that he'll be the next person to manifest, as they call it, the supreme emanation body of a Buddha. So in other words, having the whole quality of being born as a, in his case, he'll be, I think, as a Brahmin, not as a prince, but sort of going through the 12 deeds of a Buddha, so showing the aspect of, and establishing a whole tradition. After Shakyamuni teachings have disappeared from this planet, he'll come and be, a Buddha with sort of that kind of body, with the top knot and the, palms with marks and the signs and all that. So he'll this is Maitreya. So he'll manifest like that, as a sort of golden Buddha, and establish a new Buddhist tradition on the planet. So that's a different kind of manifestation in a sense. So according to the Mahayana tradition, they would say, well, he's manifesting all the time as a bodhisattva already, but that's different than the time when he'll manifest supreme enlightenment in a supreme emanation form, which is the form in which a Buddha establishes a whole tradition that then abides for however long, thousands of years, and then eventually passes away. So that's different. So they're saying that he'll be the next person to manifest that Buddhahood on this planet. Of the 1,000 Buddhas. They say there are 1,000, or sometimes say 1,002 Buddhas of this eon, so he'll be the next one.
And so this Buddha and this teaching, the dharma that we have, this will all disappear before that happens.
Yeah, they say that. The Buddha himself said that his teachings would pass away.
So that's not as a Dalai Lama, not even as a Dalai Lama exactly.
Wait, say
The
again?
same manifest as a Buddha.
Oh, like maybe.
Not related to the Dalai Lama presumably being a Buddha.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no. What they mean is just to clarify, they're according to Buddhism, actually, we talk sometimes about this different kayas. There's the Dharma kaya, which is like the mind of the Buddha. Then there's the Sambhoga kaya, which is like the body of a Buddha that abides in a kind of special kind of pure land that only bodhisattvas can see. Other beings don't have the karma to see the Sambhoga kaya. But then there's Nirmana kaya. So Nirmana kaya they call emanation bodies. So bodies that go out into the world, that ordinary beings can relate to. And so there are different types of emanation bodies that Buddhas can manifest to benefit others. And so, according to according to our tradition, they would say that the Dalai Lama we view as an emanation body of the Buddha, so a Nirmanakaya. But there's a difference between and sometimes many lamas they would say, oh, that's an emanation body of the Buddha, tulku. Actually, that word in Tibetan means Nirmanakaya. So anyway, the point being, there are different types of. So they say, for example, sometimes Buddhas will manifest emanation bodies that are artisans, like musician or a sculptor or an architect. Like that's one kind of emanation that a Buddha can manifest to benefit others. Then sometimes the Buddha will manifest as like the Dalai Lama as like a teacher, like a guru. But then there's a very specific kind of emanation body of the Buddha, a very specific kind of Nirmanakaya, called the supreme emanation body, which always has the certain marks of a Buddha, like it has 32 marks and major marks and I forget 80 minor marks. And that enacts a certain kind of life pattern, and that the role of those kinds of Buddhas is when there's no teaching on a certain planet, a Buddha will manifest that kind of body in order to establish a Buddhist tradition on that planet again for a period that will last for a period of time. So what we're saying is it would be like, so from the Mahayana perspective, you'd say, well, as long as the Dalai Lama is an emanation body of a Buddha, we would say that. In this case of Avalokiteshvara, in the Tibetan tradition, as are some other teachers, like as being emanations of Buddha, but they're not the supreme emanation body with like that have this kind of form, like the long elongated ears and the top knot, and they radiate light rays and they do all this stuff. That they only appear very rarely when beings have a certain karma to establish a new Buddhist tradition. So they would just differentiate. It's a different kind of emanation. Does that make sense? I just want to, that's the.
So Dr. Lawrence, so His Holiness, what level of Bodhisattva would he be? If he becomes like 10th level, he could be one of the Buddhas in the next birth, I would say.
According to of course, according to the Buddhist tradition, it's always complicated at this point, because sometimes they'll talk about like Avalokiteshvara, for example, and Manjushri and Tara. I mean, there are these which they're sometimes talked about as Buddhas, so for example, Avalokiteshvara is sometimes described as the embodiment of all the Buddha's compassion. Right? So in that sense, he's a Buddha. And at other times they talk about him as a bodhisattva. Then they talk about His Holiness Dalai Lama as being an emanation or a Nirmanakaya of Avalokiteshvara. So it depends upon the, I guess different people may view the Dalai Lama in different ways. And actually it's funny, right? One person could look, actually, it's true, isn't it? One person could look at the Dalai Lama and say, oh, he's a very nice person. Somebody else could look at the Dalai Lama and say he's terrible, like the Chinese government does.
Right.
And then other people would look at the Dalai Lama and say he's a bodhisattva, and then somebody else would say he's a Buddha. It's similar with Lama Tsongkhapa. Some people say, oh, he was this certain level bodhisattva. Other people say he was already a Buddha. So I guess it depends on the karmic view of the disciple in a way. But Tibetans would view him as a Buddha for the most part, as an emanation of the Buddha. I think that's true. Most Tibetan Buddhists.
I was just thinking from my own logical reasoning, if he can identify somebody is at 3rd level of Bodhisattva and 5th level of Bodhisattva, then I'm thinking he should be higher up than that.
Yeah, I think so too. That makes sense.
Well, he clearly said Asanga was in the 3rd level of Bodhisattva.
Yeah, see, you'd have to be higher than that then. Good point.
So when you see the big Chinese thing Avalokiteshvara with 1,000 arms, so is that Nirmanakaya?
Yeah, that the ones that have the
1,000 arms, right?
Yeah, and where you see they're wearing silk and ornament, they're
Like
Tara.
Tara.
Yeah, that would be a Nirmana. Yeah, that would look like. I mean, that would that would be the Sambhogakaya rather.
Sambhogakaya.
Right, that have the what's it called? Like the crown. So Sambhogakaya wears where they're wearing like a crown and they're wearing silken garments and they have jewelry on and so on. Those are usually the,
So only Buddha is Nirmanakaya. Buddha Shakyamuni Buddha.
yeah.
Oh, okay. So when they say that you're able to see like when you reach like a certain level of like a path of accumulation or whatever, when you see like Nirmanakaya, you only see Buddha as Nirmanakaya. That's the only thing.
Oh, no, I mean, so at that level, you can, actually, so a couple of things. One is, you can see, like, there comes a point on the path, there are two different points, actually. I guess there's one point where a bodhisattva, I can't remember exactly which level it's at, but there's one point where a bodhisattva can start like a sangha, or rather a tisha, started to have visions of Tara where she would talk to him and tell him what to do, and give him advice and things like that. Or Lama Tsongkhapa, there's a point in his life where he started to have visions of Manjushri, and Manjushri would give him teachings and so on. Like, so, and so there are different points where, at first, I think it's at first a bodhisattva can see Nirmanakaya of also other Buddhas. Like, so you can see the Nirmanakaya Buddha Tara, or Nirmanakaya Buddha Manjushri. And then there comes a point higher on the path where you can see this Sambhogakaya. But only bodhisattvas can see the Sambhogakaya.
But then Dr. Lan, like Manjushri and all these people were like a human being, just like His Holiness is, but they became primordial gods. So.
You know, it's interesting, like, one point they sometimes make is like, even from the point of, like once the bodhisattva is on the bhumis, let's say, they say that they can then manifest multiple bodies, actually. Like, so, and there is not, a Buddha can send infinite number.
Right.
But even a bodhisattva, they say on the first bhumi can, I think, send 100 bodies out. So like a bodhisattva at that level can have like one body that looks like Tara, and then can send out also as a ordinary looking person in one place and another place, another. That's the idea in Mahayana Buddhism. Is so the person, so even before they're a Buddha, like a bodhisattva can have what's it called, like a celestial body that's like, you know, so like they say, for example, that using the example of Avalokiteshvara, they say that before he was a Buddha, like he could manifest in the Pure Land of Amitabha, who was his guru, in a celestial body there, and then he was also on the earth, different bodies. So I think it's possible. Like, and in each bhumi they can send out more bodies. The higher they go on the path, the more they can emanate to benefit.
Right. No, but my question was like Manjushri, was that a flesh and bone body at some point in time, and then became a Buddha? But we don't read much about that. We just know about Manjushri as a god.
Oh, I see. No, yeah, there are sutras that tell stories of like how, just like Tara, Manjushri, there are actual sutras that tell the story of that person. Like, so it'll say like so many eons ago, they were a person in this place. Like, I remember the one of Tara better. Like, there's a story that she was like a princess and she made so many offerings and she kept making offerings and then, to different, like there was a different Buddha at that time and she made very extensive offerings. And then there's a story where somebody said, oh, you created a lot of merit, like, you know, so eventually you'll take birth as a man. And then she said, really? And then she said, well, I vow to stay a woman and become a Buddha as a woman. And, you know, who are you to tell me that I have to be a man?
Right.
She didn't say it like that. But she said, I vow to be a bodhisattva and then a Buddha as a female and to manifest in that kind of enlightenment. You know, and then, and so the idea was she was an ordinary person, and they described how she progressed through the path over many lifetimes and eventually became Buddha. And, so. And the same with Manjushri. They say that, you know, oh, in this past life, and that, you know, and then progressed. And they say one of Manjushri's vows when he was a bodhisattva is, which is interesting. He said, when I become one of his vows, I remember Bob Thurman quoting this thing. It was like he was quoting it from some source, but he was saying that when Manjushri was a bodhisattva, one of his vows, you know, every bodhisattva makes vows, right? So one of Manjushri's vows was, when I become a Buddha, I'll manifest in the form of a bodhisattva to ask questions about emptiness, to make sure that the Buddhas explain emptiness in detail. You know, and so he was saying like, that'll be one of my qualities as a Buddha, is I'll take the appearance of a bodhisattva, and I'll appear wherever there are Buddhas, and I'll say, Buddha, please explain emptiness. What's the meaning of emptiness? How would you know, and tell me more about emptiness. And he said, and in that way, the other people who are around will get to hear those teachings, and they'll achieve liberation and enlightenment themselves. You know, so that was one of his vows. So it depends on the vow. You know, so you get the sense of how the bodhisattvas, right? In Tara's case, it was like I'll manifest as a female. In Manjushi's case, it was I'll manifest to ask questions about emptiness. You know, they each make different commitments and vows according to their dispositions, and that determines how they manifest them.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. So the next point here, he says, so he's just completing the section on the benefits of being ordained. He says, thus, ordination is not only praised for the attainment of complete release, that is liberation from cyclic existence, but is also presented as the best basis for the accomplishment of omniscience by the perfection and tantra vehicles. The vows of ordination among the 3 vows are those of individual liberation. That is why you should respect the vows of individual liberation, the root of the teachings. So what he's saying there is actually an important point too, is sometimes people have this wrong idea. He's addressing another misunderstanding people have, where sometimes people in the past had this wrong view where they thought like, what's they say, like being a monk or a nun is the ideal form if you want to achieve your own individual liberation, but not if you're a bodhisattva or a tantric practitioner. Right? Some people had this wrong understanding. And he's saying here, that's incorrect. In other words, actually, the fully ordained monk or nun is the best form, whether you're practicing for your own liberation, whether you're a bodhisattva, or whether you're a tantric practitioner. And it doesn't say it here. There's a quote. There are some famous quotes about that. Even in the tantric teachings, like I think it's the Kala Chakra Tantra. There's a quote that says the supreme form for a Kala Chakra yogi is a monk or nun, like an ordained person. So like he's refuting this idea because sometimes people have this idea like, oh, monks and nuns, that's not the ideal form for Vajrayana, for Tantra. And he's saying that's wrong. It's the best, it's the ideal form for achieving liberation, is full ordination. So he's saying, and that's true whether you're, whichever vehicle you're practicing, that's still true. Okay, and then, oh good, we'll cover this part too. I wanted to make sure we got to this. So now he's covering what's the actual kind of path through which samsara or cyclic existence is averted. Does that make sense? So he's finally getting to this point about, in this context, so what is the path to liberation from samsara? And I'll read this quote. This is from Nagarjuna's friendly letter. It's an interesting quote. You can see the sense of passion that, remember earlier Lama Tsongkhapa was getting a sense of passion for the path? Here's Arya Nagarjuna's. Even if your head or clothes caught fire, give up preventing it and simply make an effort to destroy the occurrence of future rebirths. There's nothing else that would be better. Right? So he's saying, you get that. He's talking about how passionate one is about the path to liberation. So even if your hair is on fire, keep practicing Dharma. Then he says, and then he goes on. And now these are the 3. Through pure discipline, wisdom, and concentration, attain the immaculate stage of peace and taming, nirvana, that is ageless, deathless, and limitless, free of earth, water, fire, wind, sun, and moon. So here he's listing the actual path, right? Arya Nagarjuna. So he's saying it's discipline, wisdom, and concentration. Those 3. So I want to say first of all, it's like sometimes those are called the 3 higher trainings. They're sometimes, oftentimes in texts, they're called the 3 higher trainings and those 3 go together. And so a few different points of it. One is sometimes also in the Tibetan tradition, they sometimes in some texts you'll see where they talk about view, meditation, and action. Right, those set of 3. So this is just that, right? So in other words, the view is wisdom. Right? Meditation is the higher training and concentration, and action is discipline, right? Ethics, moral training. Right? So it's the view, meditation, and action, where the 3 higher trainings. These go together, and there's a traditional simile, I guess, for those 3, which is this. As you imagine, like the simile is this: samsara is like a giant tree. In this simile, right? So it's a tree, and they say that you want to chop down. And so that what they say is, if you're going to chop down a tree, they're using an example of an axe. Right? So they say you need a sharp axe. Right? That's wisdom. Right? A sharp that's incisive that can cut to the point. But a sharp axe is not enough. You also need a healthy body and strong shoulders. Right? So, because like if you can't lift the axe, then you can't chop down the tree. Right? And so what they're saying is that in this metaphor or simile, the strong shoulders is concentration, right, that wields the axe. But those strong shoulders have to be connected to a body, right? And that body is discipline. And so it's saying, if you don't have all three, you won't be able to chop down the tree of samsara, right? And so it's making a point, like, so for example, if you only have discipline, right, like a strong, healthy body, but you don't have an axe, you can't chop down a tree, right? And so on. So there's a similar, you know, samsara is like the tree, the body is like discipline, the strong shoulders and arms are like concentration, and the sharp axe is like wisdom. And I want to just make a couple of general comments there. So part of that is this, is like the foundation of the path to liberation is one's discipline, one's morality, one's ethics. That's the sort of basis. Without that, as we're going to get into in a minute in the text here, nothing else will happen in terms of achieving liberation. And then the idea here is that based on living a disciplined, ethical, moral life, the practitioner becomes capable of developing concentration in meditation. And that's actually quite true. You know, it's like, even if you check for yourself in your own experience, right? Like, whereas if we're caught up in like, so you say, right, if your conscience is bothering you and you're caught up in a bunch of drama, your ability to meditate will not be good at all, right? Like, you know, if you try to concentrate your mind, but you're caught up in like, you know, like drama with other people, or you've been lying, or you've been cheating, or something, right? Then in the back of your mind, you're not going to be able to have a peaceful mind, and you can't concentrate. So the point being, first of all, like, and also you won't even go to a good realm, right? Because at the time of death, you'll go to a bad realm, and in this life, you won't be able to focus. So what it's saying is, we have to begin this process. If we want to achieve the path to liberation, we have to begin with by living an ethical, moral life, which is like the foundation of everything. Based upon living that kind of life, one develops a peaceful mind that becomes capable of developing meditative concentration. And then, but meditative concentration is not enough to destroy the root of samsara, right? Because remember, if we go back, what was the root of samsara? Like, we say the negative karma, right? But then the root of karma was the mental afflictions, right? And the mental afflictions come from ignorance, right? The most fundamental or most basic of all the afflictions. And so, I just want to make this point that one needs something to counteract that ignorance. And so the only thing that can counteract ignorance, so it's the ignorance that grasps at a, say, truly existent or independent, I'll call it, say, an independent or inherently existent self. So the only thing that can undermine and completely destroy that, right, that's the very subtlest root of samsara, right? So the only thing that can destroy the ignorance that self-grasping, the ignorance grasping at a self, or the truly existent, independent, inherently existent self, is a mind that directly realizes the lack of that, which is wisdom. Right, so that's that sharp point. It has to exactly realize the lack of that object. And so part of what it's getting at, though, is that if one just I just want to go in a reverse order for a second. If one just develops a kind of intellectual wisdom that understands there's no such thing as an independent self, kind of like a professor, right? If one studies that, but one doesn't have meditative concentration, that's a bit like, you know, I was in December, I was out in California, they have the giant redwood trees. So if you imagine, like, that'd be like having a giant redwood tree and having a very sharp axe, but just sort of like tapping the axe against the tree, like going, you know, like that. It's not going to do anything to a redwood, right? Like, in other words, intellectual knowledge is not enough, is the point here, right? One has to have that correct understanding of emptiness, in a sense of wisdom, but one has to have a meditative ability, like one has to mount, in a sense, or like connect that understanding to a powerful mind of concentration, so that it'll impact the tree of samsara. So one has to have developed samadhi, deep meditative concentration, shamatha. And one can't do that without the basis of ethics. So I just did them in both orders, right? If you look in the reverse order, wisdom is not sufficient. You have to have meditative concentration, and you won't develop that unless you live an ethical, moral life. So in the context of the stages of the path to enlightenment, this is how, in terms of what is this path to liberation, is presented as the three higher trainings. Okay, so you say view, meditation, and action, three higher trainings. Right, so living a moral life, meditative concentration, and wisdom. And if you just have those three things, you can destroy the root of samsara. You don't need something else beyond those. Yeah, just it's easy, but and through those you achieve nirvana, which is the permanent state, right? So it's ageless, deathless, and limitless, right? In other words, point being, it's a permanent, right? If you achieve those three and you combine them, you achieve a permanent solution to the problem of samsaric suffering, right? It's not temporary, it's permanent, permanent freedom. And then Lama Tsongkhapa says, I think it's an interesting phrasing. He says, if I were commenting on the path of the intermediate, right? So we're in the intermediate scope beings, right? Intermediate level of the Lamrim. So he says, if I were commenting on this topic of the intermediate being, the path of intermediate beings, for my own enjoyment, an extensive commentary on the three trainings would be necessary here. It's an interesting way to put it. He says, however, since this is not the case, right? He's saying, I'm not doing this for my own enjoyment. I'm not doing this to entertain myself, right? He says, the training in wisdom, because that's not the case, the training in wisdom and special insight, and the training of the mind in the way to generate calm abiding will be explained in the context of the great scope of great beings, bodhisattvas. Therefore, here I will only briefly state the way to train in ethics. So what's he saying there? What he's saying is, you know, in the next section is going to begin the great scope, right? The path of the bodhisattva. In the path of the bodhisattva, there are 6 perfections, right? So, and the last of the 6 perfections is the perfection of wisdom, first of all, right? And he's saying, so wisdom will be presented there, in the context, and he'll present it in great detail there, actually, as we'll see. So he says, so he's saying that's going to be presented there. And he says the 5th perfection is the perfection of concentration, meditative concentration. And again, he's pointing out that's going to be explained there. So I'm not going to go into detail here because it would be too wordy, in a sense. Right? And then he's saying, so I'm going to leave those for later. We'll get there, you know, kind of thing. They're in this text. He says, but for now I'm going to briefly review the importance of ethics because that's so important. Does that make sense? So we'll get to those other topics as we go through the 6 perfections. And then he starts to talk a little bit about, so this next section here, which goes on for a few pages. So the whole middle scope has about 3 1/4 more pages. He's going to mainly talk about ethics. And he starts with the benefits of guarding ethics. So again, he begins by quoting Arya Nagarjuna's friendly letter. Rules are the base and the foundation of all good qualities. So it says, like the earth, for what moves and what doesn't. Right? So again, first thing is what I was using that same metaphor, is that from Nagarjuna. So he's saying that the ethics is like the earth itself. Right? So the earth and he's saying the earth is the foundation for things that move and things that don't move. Right? Meaning like things that move are like us, right? Sentient creatures. We all travel around on the earth. Right? Even birds that fly have to come back to the earth. And then he's saying, and then for things that don't move, like stones and houses, and, things that are sort of that don't move of their own volition, they also rest on the earth. Even crops, right, grow from the earth. And he's using this metaphor. He's saying, so like the earth that supports everything, all spiritual qualities are supported by our ethics. I sort of pause there because again, the idea is to relate this to ourselves, right? It's because he's not saying this. Obviously, as he already pointed out, he's not saying this for his own entertainment. Right? He just pointed that out. So what he's saying is, if we want to live a spiritual life, that we should reflect on this for ourselves, right? And say, am I living an ethical life? Because that's the foundation of everything. And if I'm not, then I'm like, I'm trying to build my spiritual life in an earthquake zone. It's like, it's not going to go well. Or an active volcano, maybe, I don't know. But so what he's saying here is like, Nagarjuna is saying, and Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, if we want to live a spiritual life, we have to begin by focusing on ethics, right? On living an ethical life, on being an ethical person, right? And that means, and that's an important point, right? That means like there are little interactions with people, right? Like it's not, like what he's getting at here is not some big, like, big event or like fireworks show or something. It's how we act in our daily life, right? With people around us. Like, so are we honest with them? Are we honest in our, dealings with other people? Are we straightforward? Are we, do we do any kinds of, are we deceitful or not, and so on, right? And so then we have to, this applies to us. So then he quotes another from the Tantra requested by Subabu. Just as crops grow faultlessly in dependence upon the ground, depending on ethics, moistened by the water of compassion, the most superior wholesome qualities grow. And so he says, you should think about it according to these statements. Right? And again, I just want to point something out, which is, sometimes, I was thinking this the other day, like, especially as, like, in our culture or something, sometimes we can have this, like, feeling like, because, like, we're used to, like, I think, because of modernity, we're used to, like, things happening quickly. Right? Like, we get upset if our computer doesn't start up quick fast or something, we have this idea, expectation. And then sometimes we can get, like, if, in the spiritual, one thing is in the spiritual life, of course, things don't, it's not like a button push, right? Like, you can't hit enter and then it prints or something. It's a much more organic process, which is his metaphor, right? It's an organic, like growing crops. Right, where you can't, you can't push a button to make the crops grow faster. Right? But what he's getting at, I think, is an important point, which is, if you put the right causes in, it happens. Right? That's what he's saying here, in a sense, right? And he's saying the earth is ethics, right? And then the water, oftentimes water is a metaphor. Compassion and water are used because water softens. Right? Just like compassion softens our heart, right? If something's hard, and you put it, like if earth is like hard, or even even when we cook, right? Like if you start with like hard, it would crack pasta or rice or something, and then you cook it in water and it gets soft, right? So it's a metaphor for our own hearts, right? Our hearts can be hardened, and then when we bring compassion to them, they soften. Right? And what he's getting at here, in a sense, right, is it's not that hard to make progress, right? Like he's saying, be really careful with your ethics and cultivate compassion, and naturally, other good qualities will grow spiritually. Does that make some sense? And there are many quotes like that where they'll say things like, even Pabonka Rinpoche says things like that, like even at things that you think would be impossible to achieve. Like you're joking there. But Pabonka Rinpoche makes this point. He says even things that you would think are impossible to achieve, if you create the causes for them, then like even if you tried to stop them from happening, they'll happen, right? Because the causes are there. And then he's saying, whereas if the causes aren't there, then even if you wanted to like smash something to make them happen, it won't happen, right? And so here he's saying, Lama Tsongkhapa is quoting this tantra to say, so this is how we do it, right? Is you practice, you be more and more careful with your ethics and your morality with other people and with yourself, and you practice compassion. Those are like very, down to earth, using the same metaphor, things we can do. And if we do those, he's saying all the other, right? What does he say? The most superior wholesome qualities will grow. Does that make sense? So he's saying we have to begin with that. So it's like, and then, going back to the things earlier that I just said about, the view and meditation, right? View and meditation come from the action or the behavior of ethics. Then he says, the shortcomings of not guarding ethics, right? Just as guarding ethics you have adopted brings enormous benefit, likewise there are great disadvantages to not guarding your ethics. And then he quotes a sutra called the Sutra Cherishing Monks. It says, ethics is happiness, this is a good quote from the Buddha, ethics is happiness for some, for others ethics is suffering. For those who have it, it's happiness. For those who breach it, it's suffering. Right? So it's pretty straightforward. They can need much explanation. Then he quotes a tantra, the root tantra of Manjushri. And again I'll read. If discipline declines in those who recite there will be no highest attainments, nor will there be middling attainments. Even the least ones will remain absent. The king of sages did not teach mantra attainments for those of loose discipline, nor is that the place or direction to go to the city of nirvana. Right? So there are a couple of points implicit in this. One is, you know, if somebody, and one of the commentaries went into detail on this, sometimes people have this wrong view, like if they, because he's quoting a tantra here, right? So sometimes people have some wrong view where they think, oh, because I practice, like if somebody took some initiation or Vajrayana, like, oh, I'm Vajrayana, so like ethics doesn't apply to me, or I'm somehow beyond that. And here he's saying that's completely wrong. You know, Lama Tsongkhapa always attacks those kind of wrong ideas. You know, there is that, and what he's saying here is two different points are made. One is where it says recite. If discipline declines in those recite, what he's saying is if you're doing like tantra, in tantra you recite mantras, you recite prayers, sadhanas, right, and so on. And he's saying if you do your sadhana, like you go and you do some mantras and you do your sadhana, you do retreat or something, but you're not practicing ethics, he says you won't achieve the highest attainment, the middling attainment, or even the lowest level of attainment. So you won't achieve anything, that's the point. And so he's saying it's a waste of time. Like, don't even bother to go off and recite things and do some kind of mantras if you're not being ethical. Because ethics is the ground, right? Nothing will grow if you don't have that. And then he's saying, if you don't have ethics, you will not travel to the city of nirvana, right? That's not where you're going to head. If you don't have ethics, you'll go somewhere else. That's what he's saying. Then he goes on, how could there be in such bad children any attainments of mantra at all? For those who disregard ethics, how could there be happy realms? If do they not become higher beings, nor beings bound for the highest bliss, what need to mention their accomplishing the mantras that the victor taught? So he's saying ethics is and again, if you look at what he's saying there, from a positive perspective, right, he's saying ethics is the foundation of a peaceful mind, right? It's also a foundation of good rebirths in the future. It's also the foundation of progressing on the path to enlightenment, and then of highest bliss, right? So in other words, by being ethical, one gradually progresses to the highest bliss of enlightenment itself. But if we don't practice ethics, then all those things won't come, right? Because things don't happen without a cause. Right? And one of the causes of all those good things is our ethics. So we have to practice ethics. And again, ethics, the good thing is it's something we can do, right? Like if we started with you know, achieve calm abiding and use it to realize emptiness, we might say, oh, well, I can't do that. But this is something we can do, right? We can be ethical. How there are great benefits generating ethics nowadays. Oh, this is interesting. So first is he quotes the Samadhi Raja, the king of Samadhi king of meditative stabilization sutra, the Samadhi Raja sutra. It says, the trainings that I taught to those who wear the lady's gray apparel, even monks who are fully ordained will not have those trainings at that time. So he's saying at the time when, according to that statement, so what he's getting at is now, right? Whereas he's saying that what he's getting at here really is this, is, I'll read the rest of it and then we'll explain it. For those who at the time of the Dharma, when the Dharma decays and the Sugata's teachings come to an end, practice a single training day and night, their merit will extraordinarily exceed that of one who for eons, like the Ganges sand grains, with a mind of faith honors billions of Buddhas with food, drink, parasols, banners, and garlands of light. So what he's saying here is, in the time of degeneration, which is now, right? We're in the time of degeneration, a degenerate era, they sometimes call it. So what he's saying is, to practice even one ethical discipline well in this degenerate time is, first of all, he's making a couple points. One is it's humongously beneficial because it's harder, right? And there are fewer people doing it. And so, you know, sometimes, I just make a point here, sometimes like we can, I think ordinary people, we can feel like discouraged. Like if you look around sometimes in the world and you see like wars and, you know, deceit, lying, cruelty, and so on in the world, it's like easy to feel discouraged, right? And just to feel like, oh, it's just hopeless or something. And part of what the Buddha here is saying is first of all, he's acknowledging that in other words, that there will be times like this, right? Times of degeneration, which is what we're born into. But then he's making an important point. He's saying he's saying in times like this, there's more benefit to practice, you know, especially discipline. Like, in other words, to be moral in a time, and part of what he's getting at is like, you know, if you were born at the time, let's say during the time of the Buddha, where you were surrounded by arhats, right, and seeing the Buddha himself, there was so much inspiration then that it was like relatively easy to practice moral training. But now it's much harder, right? And so what he's saying here is, don't give up hope, actually, that to practice even one moral training now creates more benefit, right? Creates more benefit karmically, because you're doing it, it's like you're lighting a lamp in a time of darkness. Does that make sense? Which is different. Like, you know, there's a lamp, like if you light a lamp at noon on a sunny day, it may be pretty, but it's not really gonna help anybody particularly, right? Whereas if you're like in the midst of the darkness and you light a lamp, right? Well, like that's helping people to see, you know what I mean? And so he's making this point, he's saying this is a time where it's really beneficial to practice even one training. And then he gives this analogy, right? He says it's more meritorious than if you were to honor billions of Buddhas with food and drinks and parasols and banners and garlands of light for eons equaling the number of grains of sand, and as many eons as there are grains of sand, like in the river Ganges, which is a very long river in India. Right? And so he's saying, he's giving inspiration to people like us, right, who could otherwise be discouraged. And he's saying, now is the time. Take on a training of morality. And he says, and that will bring great benefit to you, more than if you had done all that, right? If you think of like trying to practice generosity for all those eons, like that'd be very difficult, right? We run out of, you know, if you just try to offer a lot of food, parasols, drinks, and banners, you run out of money really fast, even now, like, right? For a few months, and then you'd be broke, so whatever, a few weeks. He's saying here, like, but if you take one moral training and you practice for your whole life, it's more beneficial than that. So he's saying, so take heart.
Dr. Lawrence, so it almost feels like our collective karma is relative. That's what this says. When you say it's a degenerate times,
Yeah, it's like our karma, exactly.
it's a collective karma we're talking about.
Yeah.
And then in that context, any ethics or any action that you do is very relative in terms of cause and effect.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and then again, like, and it's harder, right? But the fact that it's harder is a good thing, right? And if you're practicing, because then if you make the effort, it has more benefit. You create a more powerful karmic tendency. And one more point sometimes I sometimes add here is like, you know, so one thing is, there are many ways we can do this, I just want to point out. One is we can just like, let's see, right. You know, one is we can like pay attention, you know, so we can for ourselves like say, okay, what's one area where I can be better in my own ethics in life, right? Because like, you know, the truth I think is it's not easy, right? Like in other words, you can't say overnight I'm going to suddenly improve in 20 different areas. Well, you could say that, but you probably won't succeed, right? But if we make effort and sort of say, okay, I'm going to pick one area of moral training and I'm going to try to get better at it. And we like make some effort at that and slowly you improve, and then you say, okay, now I'll pick another one. I'll slowly get better at that. Then we can improve over time. That's one point. Then there's another point, which is there are these practices like it's commonly given, we've done it at the center at times, the 8 is like the 1 day vows, something's called the 8 Mahayana precepts. Right, where you take 8 precepts for a single day, and whether you're a lay person or a monastic, it doesn't matter, you can do that. And it's like, and then the one benefit of the 1 day vows is that we can keep them very purely because it's just 1 day, right? So we can like, you know, take them and you take them from sunrise, like just before sunrise until the next day, just before sunrise. So then it's not that hard because you can say, okay, for 1 day I can be very like, what's the word, mindful of my moral training, and you know, like you just eat 1 meal and you don't, you know, you don't lie, don't steal, and so on. But so that would be another example of this, like taking those vows and practicing that periodically when you have time would be another example of like sort of a way of doing something very purely and creating a very pure karma in a degenerate time, and so on. So anyway, there are many ways to sort of practice that, you know. And the other point though is like if you've taken if any you know individual person here, if you've taken refuge, or you've taken layperson vows, or bodhisattva vow, or tantric vow, you know, then to, another point is to study them, right? And then to like say, okay, let me pick one and try to get better at that, and then pick another. You know, so there are one way of being ethical is the 10 non-virtues, right? Like avoiding them. Another is to go through your sets of, if you've taken some kind of vows yourself, then you can review them and say, well, let me try to get better at this one or that one. And notice which ones you maybe have a hard time with and say, well, okay, let me try to get better at that. So, probably one more. I'm just trying to, so we have like 10 more minutes. Any questions, or else should I cover one more point? Okay. So then he's getting at here, if we want to train in ethics, he's getting at how to improve our ethics. And so he's saying among the 4 causes of the occurrence of downfalls, the antidote to not knowing the trainings is to study them and know them well. So we're going to go through the 4, they're all here. But so what he's getting at is the, right, so the first, so the first of the 4 faults in terms of not, of like, what's the word, ethical failings, is not knowing right from wrong. You know, obviously if you don't know right from wrong, it's hard to practice doing the right thing. And so, in that sense, that's pretty straightforward, right? There's, if you don't know the details of how to be an ethical person, well then study that, right? And again, like there are different levels of this, right? So, the first one would be the 10 non-virtues, right? So we covered that. So you could go back through the text and say, okay, how am I doing? Which ones am I sometimes breaking? And how can I get better at those? And studying, remember we went through like what's the object, and what's the, the correct discrimination of the object, and what's your motivation, your intention, and what's the afflictive emotion, and how does that give rise to an intention, and so on. So you can actually study all of that more, and then apply it to yourself, right? And see how you're doing, so that's one. Then if you again, I was giving these examples, if you've taken certain like individual liberation vows, well then to study, well what's the definition of that, right? Like, let's say or if you took refuge, for example, like there are certain, precepts of refuge. So go back, it's easy, online, they're in books, it's not hard to find. But if we don't review them every now and then, like one is, for example, to take refuge 3 times in the day and 3 times at night, right? So to check, well, am I doing that or not, right? And if I'm not, if I took refuge and I'm not doing that, then then I'm not keeping a commitment I made. So, okay, I could do better. That doesn't take, whereas that doesn't take any time at all, really. You can do that, like while you're laying in bed, you can do it while you're driving, you can do it while you're walking, it's not some big ritual, it's something you can just do, right? Because taking refuge is something you do in your heart, right? Where so like if you think, okay, if I'm not really doing that, that's easy, I can start doing that. You can even do it while you're brushing your teeth or something. It does not have to be something like, but we can do it. Does that make sense? So you study like the precepts of refuge. So I'm just making a point where it says study, right? Study the trainings. And then if you've taken the bodhisattva vow, right, which often is given separately or sometimes given as part of empowerment. There's lots of texts in English about the bodhisattva vow, right? So to read, what is that? Like sometimes people took the bodhisattva vow but then don't read it. Like don't read what's the vow actually. And then there are like guidelines, right? So like, and again, because what's the bodhisattva vow, right? It's a vow of a bodhisattva to be a benefit to others.
But if you don't have bodhicitta, it doesn't matter, right?
No, you can still, like, even if you don't have bodhicitta like fully, like there is you can take the bodhisattva vow and like, let's say it right. Actually, you can take the bodhisattva vow before you're a bodhisattva in that sense. And you can try your best to keep it. Does that make sense? So like you can study it and say, and that's part of the training to realize bodhicitta actually, is to try to train in that. So even if you're not a bodhisattva in the sense of how you realize bodhicitta, like for example, one bodhisattva vow is part of it is that you try to generate bodhicitta, right? So even if you don't have it yet, you aspire to it and you keep trying. And then there are many trainings, so for example, like if somebody's in need and asks you for help, a sick person, then you go help them, or if there's, there are different trainings like that. Like, so we can try to do those as best we can, and then we get better at it. Like, that's how we get better, and then eventually you realize bodhicitta if you do it now. So, so you don't have to have already realized bodhicitta to take the bodhisattva vow. Right? There's one bodhisattva vow, there are also 2 levels of the bodhisattva vow. There's the aspiring, where you're wishing, and then there's the engaging, where you're actually trying to do the behavior of the bodhisattva. So if you've taken either of those, you can study, like, how do I keep it? And even if you can't keep it perfectly, we do our best by studying it. But that's how we get better at it. And then if you're taking tantric, especially highest yoga tantra initiation, then there are tantric vows, so you can study those also. Again, all these are in English, so you can study them, and they're like really good texts that describe like the very detailed points, how to keep them, and if you like damage them, how to repair them, and all that. So you can study that. But does that make sense? So in other words, with ethics, if we're not, and like oftentimes, my own experience is you have to review it sometimes. You know, like just studying it once is not enough because we forget. Like, so you have to look back every now and then and say, how am I doing? Like, let me look back at a text about one of the sets of moral trainings and check in. How am I doing lately? And if I'm making mistakes, then how do I fix them? You know, and so on. Like, so that's it. I'll cover one last point and then we'll stop. So the first was you know, so not knowing. The second fault of the four is non-conscientiousness, right? So in other words, and that's what we were getting at a second ago. Like, even if you know the vows or the commitments or what morality is, if you're not conscientious about it, then that doesn't help that much, right? Obviously. And so Lama Tsongkhapa lists 5 points. He said, so I'll go through them very briefly. First one is the mindfulness that does not forget the observed objects and aspects of what to adopt and what to abandon. Right? And so I want to point out this mindfulness, right? Like, you know, sometimes we talk about mindfulness, like mindfulness of breathing or mindfulness of sensations or mindfulness, you know, different like that. So mindfulness means like not forgetting, right? Like being aware of. So being aware of it means you haven't forgotten about it, right? Like, so if you're trying to be aware of your breath, right, you're being mindful of it, and you don't let your mind just go off to some other topic. Here he's saying to be mindful of what to adopt and what to abandon. It means what's ethical, right? And so I just want to give an example of what he's getting at there, right? Like, let's use the example of around karma, right? Well, I won't get into the vows, but let's use the example of a vow, like around lying. I'll just use that, right? So, if one's being mindful, right? If one's not being mindful, then like, you know, somebody says something and like you want to be comfortable, you don't want them to look at you funny, and so you say something that's not quite true, right? Because you don't want them to like kind of give you a dirty look or whatever, or get mad at you or not like you or something. And so maybe you lie, right? So that's no mindfulness at all, right? But if we're really being mindful, then what do? We actually like watch our mind, right? So you watch your mind, you see so let's say, again, you're in that same situation, right? Like if you're being mindful, you recognize, first of all, okay, you know, saying something untrue is, to somebody else, is the very definition of being unethical. One of the points of lacking ethics, right? In terms of the 10 non-virtues, it's in that list, right, lying. In terms of all the different like precepts of vows that's included in the monastic vows, layperson vows, you know, it's one of the fundamental points of ethics, right? And then you can check in your own mind, right? Like, if you're watching this, so you know that, right? And then you check in your own mind, why would I, like, if you ask yourself, why would I lie, right? It's actually we've studied this before, it's the 8 worldly concerns, right? So it's some kind of concern about what do people think of me, or what's my profit, how do I get over on somebody, you know, whether I'm wanting their respect, or I'm wanting business from them, so I'm wanting some kind of like profit, or, right, like, so I'm going to be deceitful to get something from my, like, in some kind of, what's the word, out of, usually, I mean, it could be out of hatred or something, but more often lying is more often out of desire, right, some kind of grasping, clinging, craving, right? And so if you're being mindful, you would watch your mind, and you'd go like, oh, look at me, I'm like craving after, like, so I'm interacting with this person, and instead of having genuine kindness or affection or genuineness with them, I'm wanting something from them, right? And I'm trying to, like, I'm having some feeling of wanting to manipulate them, right? And then if you watch your mind, it's like, well, that's the mental affliction, right? It's craving. Let's say you're craving after praise or whatever, profit or something, right? So you have a mental affliction, right? So already there's a problem, right? So if you're being mindful, you'd be going, uh-oh, I have a mental affliction. That's not helpful. Let me get rid of that, right? Then at the minimum, right, the mental affliction has not yet become an intention, right? Remember, because this is how karma works, right? So you have a mental affliction. Oh, I want them to think I'm wonderful, whatever, right? Then, like, you start to give rise to an intention. Like, oh, if I tell them that I agree with them about this, even though I don't, then they're going to think I'm great, or whatever. I tell them I did something I didn't do, then they'll think I'm great, right? And then you start developing intention. Yeah, I should do that. Right? It's not like subtle in our mind. If you're not watching it, you don't even notice it happening. But it's happening, right? So if you give rise to that intention, then you've already done some karma, right? Karma is intention. Right? So we can go back and say, oh, wait. If you're being mindful, you would say, no, wait, stop. Don't give rise to an intention to do that. That's lying. That's deceit. This is a real person. I don't need to deceive them. Also, if I deceive them and I lie, it's not going to get me something good. It's going to get me something bad, right? I'm going to ruin my own peace of mind. I'm going to agitate myself. I'm going to have to worry if they find out that I lied. And also, I'm creating bad karma that will lead me to a lower realm in the future. So I think I'm getting some profit, but I'm actually harming myself. You know, like, and so you would remember all these things, you know, in the moment, quickly, hopefully. But, and then you would think, I don't even want to have that mental affliction, actually. Like, it's ruining my peace of mind. Like, let me just let it go. I don't need anything from this person. Let me actually just be present in the present moment with them, one human being to another, and drop the pretense, right? And then, like, if you actually do that, immediately you have some peace of mind, actually, right? You get some peace. So that's an example of being mindful, right? So, like, and the point being, I just want to, the reason why I went through all that is, one is that's an example of it, but also that's how the training in ethics gives you peace of mind even now. Like, it benefits you in future lives, right? Because you don't lie and therefore you don't create the karma that's going to carry you to negative experiences in the future. But even in the present, if you do that, you get peace of mind right away, right? Where you're like, you can drop the pretense, you don't have to be something, and it's like, well, who cares what, like, they could like me, they could not like me, I'm going to smile at them, just be kind to them. And that's up to them what they want to do, it's okay, you know, like, it's no big deal, right? Like, it's so much more, like, peaceful and grounded, does that make sense? And so all the trainings in ethics are like that, right? Like, you know, there's the extreme ones, right? If you're, like, angry at somebody and then you want to harm them or something, right? But always you can watch, right? If you're watching your own mind, there's the mental affliction, right? The anger or something. Then there's some, eventually it gives rise to an intention, right? Remember we talked about that? Like, the mental afflictions are pathways to an intention, right? So if you let the mental affliction keep burning, eventually it flames up into an intention, and then you start to, you know, and then that's already karma, and then you do something based on that, physical or verbal, and you create more negative karma. Does that make sense? Like, so if we're being mindful, we're remembering all this, like, and again, it doesn't have to be some, like, big complicated thing. It's like, well, I don't want to live with mental afflictions. I don't want to give rise to negative intentions. So let me watch my mind and stop it when it starts to arise. Okay, does that make sense, though, how you train? So, like, so when it says mindfulness, it'd be remembering, like, the rules or the guidelines, but it's also applying them in that way into the moment. Maybe we'll stop there because we went over the time. And next time we'll pick up with this, next week we'll pick up with this point about the antidotes. And I think next week we'll probably finish this section. So the section of the middle scope. So we'll probably finish that next week. And then we'll move on to the great scope, the final section of Ram Rim, which is the biggest section.